With the first Ultima came a large number of new challenges. Actually, a Calibeth was taken entirely into Ultima 1 and in fact was a subroutine inside of the first Ultima. So the dungeon corridors are in fact the same code as I originally wrote for a Calibeth. But in addition, we layered on outdoors and towns and castles, as well as, more importantly, a real user interface and items to collect and quests to go on, and ultimately even a way to win the game, none of which were accessible or available in the first Calibeth. With Ultima 2, again, Ultima 2 is going to be the very first ever completely assembly language program I ever wrote. And so that was a very daunting task because it went very, very slowly, of course, at first, as I was teaching myself as I wrote. And we really, again, dramatically expanded the scope of the game. In fact, whereas a Calibeth and Ultima 1 were kind of medieval fantasy games that took place in one geography, Ultima 2, we actually expanded that quite a bit, where we actually had not only fictional technology that expanded up to even space travel, but along with that came, we created all the planets of the solar system and many more cities, many more towns, as well as different kind of time periods you could go visit these things. So it was a much grander game. Ultima 3 was kind of the first of my carefully crafted technologies where I actually had the skills to accomplish what I could envision. In the previous games, it was always the challenge was to learn the skill to craft the vision, and Ultima 3 was kind of the first one that where I actually had the skills necessary or had the tools by which I could at least approach that problem. So Ultima 3 was the scope of the game was much better contained, whereas Ultima 2 was really just kind of wild, all kinds of gaming elements all thrown into one game. Ultima 3 had a much more contained, cohesive design sense. So for Ultima 4, I said, look, I want to, versus have this game where you go pillage and plunder to become the powerful supposed hero, in the real world, heroes generally do good deeds, not pillage and plunder. And I sat back and thought about that and like, well, why do people do good deeds in the real world? And the answer, in my mind, in the real world, is because the more good deeds you do, the more people will help you. And if you do bad deeds, people will generally try to stop you. And in most fantasy games, that kind of very simple cause and effect that encourages good behavior does not exist. And so Ultima 4 was an exploration in kind of activity and consequence. Ultima 5 was a much more carefully crafted story where the government became much more like the Spanish Inquisition, fairly oppressive, supposedly having a good goal in mind, but in a fairly oppressive way. And characters you'd meet in the game were not just either truly good guys or truly bad guys, but could be people, for example, who were profiting upon the new fairly oppressive government, or people who were resisting the government for the right reason, but still good people down deep. And so when you'd move through the game, the choices you had to make as a player were far more complex and things you really had to give more thought to. So it was a very, in my mind, it was one of the best crafted stories in an Ultima. And now with 6, we were very careful to start where 5 left off. So we're beginning to plan a history, not forward-looking yet, but looking back. We're at least kind of making sure we have continuity with characters and fiction going forward. So Ultima 6 kind of rounded out what I now look back on and call the Virtue Trilogy, where, in fact, in 4, 5, and 6, there are no antagonists to go defeat. And they're all kind of personal exploration games where it's really, again, 4 is proving yourself to be a person of good virtue. 5 is what happens when the government gets involved and starts legislating morality. And 6 is a game about social tolerance. Ultima 7 is the game that I really consider having the best virtual world creation within it so far. So not only could you see now almost anything we could envision, so there were knives and plates and spoons and really every item within the world that we considered we could easily simulate. But also we tried to make as many of those function as we possibly could. So you could actually go and harvest crops and grind those crops into wheat and take that wheat and add water and sugar and make flour and take that flour and bake bread and then eat or sell that bread. And basically every other aspect of reality we simulated to as complete a degree as we possibly could. So not only to have, I think, a very well-told story within it, but it also is a very well simulated virtual world. A number of people probably wonder exactly why I sit around in costumes like this in the dungeon of my home, and often go by the name Lord British. Well, that's an interesting story too that goes back into my youth, which goes back again to the days that I often speak about of just getting into computers and into role-playing games and reading fantasy work as well. And the actual detail is the summer of my sophomore year in high school, I was actually up at OU taking a summer course they had set up for high school students, which is where I got exposed to a lot of this fantasy literature and gaming. And the students who were there ahead of me were kind of going room to room, and as new students would arrive, they would give them a nickname, and those nicknames generally became the names of their fantasy characters as we all get into role-playing after that. And some of the students that were there ahead of me actually thought I spoke with a British accent, which, by the way, I don't, and at least I don't think I do. And so they named me British, so my nickname became British. So I went out and spent what I thought was an enormous amount of money, which was $200, and invested in Ziploc bags and made some Xerox cover sheets and stapled together some little instruction booklets that I'd run off at the printer next door. And we hung those Ziploc bags that, with the discs that I'd hand copied there on the store at the Computerland. And one of those first few copies that we sold that first week, we sold about 5 copies that first week, found its way to California to the publisher of my mentor at the time, a guy named Bill Budge. And I got a call from California. They said there were plane tickets waiting for me at the airport. I flew to California, signed a publishing contract, and thus I actually became part of this industry as they started mailing me money. None of us ever anticipated how successful Ultima would be, how successful Origin would be, quite frankly, how successful the software industry would be. I mean, none of us, especially in those early days, anticipated any particular tenure for the entire industry. I mean, when we first began, it was really day at a time kind of activity where we knew how well we had done with the first one, so we projected we'd at least do 1 or 2 more that would do equally well. But there was always this kind of thought in the back of your mind that, well, when entertainment software kind of runs its course, maybe we'll have to get into business software or joystick manufacturing or go back to school and get a real job. Ultima 4 is another commonly mentioned favorite. In fact, it's one of my favorites. And it's really because of the aspect of virtues and things that were brought out in those games. It was a very different tack than had been seen before in the Ultima series, or has really been seen before or since in kind of the storytelling within fantasy games. 5 is another really commonly mentioned one as a favorite. And the reason why there is because it's one of the most well-told stories, I think, in the sense of whereas 4 was fairly black and white and pretty easy to tell what you need to do, and in my mind fairly repetitive. 5 had a much more subtlety to it and was really a well-crafted story. 7's another common answer. In fact, 7's probably my other personal favorite. And the reason why 7 often shows up as a favorite is it was the best simulated, completely virtual world, in the sense of literally the sandbox aspect of virtual reality that was presented within that world was by far the most complete we've done to date in an Ultima. Well, Ultima Online also has a special place in the series that really kind of goes back to some of the fundamentals of role-playing. Role-playing games, in my mind, are fundamentally social experiences versus strategy games associated with statistics. And that's a subtle difference that I think is very important, that makes the Ultima series in general stand out as unique compared to other role-playing games.